Shalom Aleichem and welcome to Parsha Lomdus on Parshas Ekev. This week's Shiur has been generously sponsored by Mנחat Mendel Reben, the Chizuk Kashrus, and we wish him Hatzlacha Rabba Umuflaga in all of his endeavors and Yashakayach for the sponsorship. Now to the Shiur. So in the beginning of this week's Parsha, Perek Ches Pasuk Yud, we have the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon. V'achalta v'savato beirachta, person will eat and be satisfied, and they will have a chiyuv. They have a chiyuv then to bench the Eibishter, the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon. But Pashtus, most Rishonim are of the opinion that the mitzvah min HaTorah is only if you ate kedei seviyah, only if you became satisfied. If you did not become satisfied, but you ate more than a kezayis, then you have a chiyuv Birkas Hamazon mid'Rabbanan. But min HaTorah it's only v'savata, only if you ate kedei seviyah, only if you became satisfied. Now, there's an interesting machlokes between the Magen Avraham and the Pri Megadim. This is in Shulchan Aruch, Xayim, Siman Reish Yud. In the following case, this is the Magen Avraham in Tzivkot Aleph. He says, Im ochal ma'at, v'chozar v'ochal ma'at, im sho yoyser michdei achilas pras. Say a person ate a little bit, and then waited more than kedei achilas pras, more than the amount of time that it takes to eat a piece of bread, which is a shir kedei achilas pras, and then he ate a little more, and he waited again b'chdei achilas pras, then he ate a little more. So in the end, Hitaka became satisfied, but his eating was done in stages. So says the Magen Avraham, nearly the ein mitzdaref. He says it seems to him that in such a case, this eating is not mitzdaref into one eating, and there's no chiyuv in Birkas Hamazon, because each time you ate, it's a separate act. You ate now, you ochal ma'at. This amount did not have enough to be mechayiv you in Birkas Hamazon. Then you ate 20 minutes later. That second eating is not mitzdaref with the earlier eating, since you waited between these two eatings more than kedei achilas pras, so they're not mitzdaref. So now the second eating, weiter, you only ate ma'at. There isn't enough in that second eating by itself to be mechayiv you in Birkas Hamazon. And then 20 minutes later you ate again. So each eating by itself was only ma'at, has no chiyuv in Birkas Hamazon. And we're not mitzaref all these eatings together, because in between each one, you waited more than kedei achilas pras. So for that reason, there would be no chiyuv to say Birkas Hamazon. That's the opinion of the Magen Avraham. However, the Pri Megadim there, also Sivkotten in Eishel Avraham, Sivkotten Aleph, the Pri Megadim says, no. Umiyu, im achal ad shesova, if a person ate until he was satisfied, bebirchas hamazon, chayiv min haTorah, af she'achal ma'at ma'at. So the Pri Megadim says, punkt verkehrt. If a person ate kedei seviyah, if you ate enough to be satisfied, even if you ate ma'at ma'at, as in the case of the Magen Avraham, the Pri Megadim says, still, you're chayiv bebirchas hamazon min haTorah. So we have this machlokes. So let's try to understand what are the svaros behind this machlokes. Why does the Magen Avraham say that if you ate ma'at and you waited more than kedei achilas pras, it's not mitzdaref and you're not chayiv to bench? And the Pri Megadim says you are. So the Xhinukh on our Parsha, the Xhinukh brings this Magen Avraham, and he explains a beautiful pshat, a beautiful understanding in the Magen Avraham. He says, if you look at the pasuk says, "V'achalta, v'savata ubeirachta." So the way the Minchas Chinuch understands the pasuk, there's actually two dinim. In order to bench, in order to be chayiv in Birkas Hamazon, there has to be v'achalta, there has to be a din achila, and v'savata, and there has to be a din of seviyah. They're both necessary components, both necessary criteria to create the chiyuv of Birkas Hamazon. So that's the svara of the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham says, if you ate ma'at, and you waited more than kedei achilas pras in between each eating, it's true that you were makayim the inyan of a savata. At the end, you're feeling satisfied, so you have the kiyum of a savata, but you don't have the v'achalta, because there was no achila. And achila, says the Minchas Chinuch, Al pi halacha, what's an achila? An achila is only if you eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. Only eating a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras is called an achila. So therefore, if you ate ma'at, says the Minchas Chinuch, even though you have the v'savata, you don't have a ve'achalta. To be chayiv in Birkas Hamazon, we need both dinim. There has to be a din of ve'achalta. You have to have an achila. What's considered an achila? A kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. And on top of that, you have to have a v'savata. And only when you have both is there a chiyuv of ubeirachta. If you're missing one, either one, if you have a ve'achalta, if you eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, but you don't have a savata, or vice versa, you have a savata, but you ate it ma'at, but you don't have a achalta, you didn't eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. If you're missing either one, there's no chiyuv of ubeirachta. That's the svara of the Magen Avraham. The Minchas Chinuch goes on to say that he's mesupak, he has a safek in this opinion of the Magen Avraham, whether you need to eat only a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, or you have to eat the whole kedei seviyah b'chtei achilas pras. Meaning, do I say that v'achalta and v'savata are two separate dinim? There's a din v'achalta, there's a din v'savata, each one is a separate din, and only after you have both is there a chiyuv of ubeirachta. And if I say that it's two separate dinim, then it would come out that v'yachalta, din achila, is you have to eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. Eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, you have the v'yachalta. Then on top of that, you have to have a savata, so now you have to become satisfied. So for the rest of the food, that you can eat ma'at, that you can eat slowly until you become satisfied. And then you have a chiyuv to bench. That's if I say that v'yachalta v'savata are two separate dinim. Or perhaps the other tzad is to say, no, v'yachalta v'savata go together. You have to eat v'savata, and that has to be connected to the achila. And an achila is only an achila if it's b'chtei achilas pras. So you have to eat the whole shiur of kedei seviyah b'chtei achilas pras. So that's the suffix of the Minchas Chinuch in the Magen Avraham. Does the Magen Avraham think it's two separate things? Eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, so you're makayim the v'achalta, and then everything else til b'savata, doesn't matter how you eat it, even ma'at. Or does the Magen Avraham think v'achalta v'savata go together, and you have to eat the whole v'savata as one achila b'chtei achilas pras? But al kaponim, what is clear from the Minchas Chinuch is that the Magen Avraham learns that there are two different dinim. V'achalta, there has to be an achila, and an achila is only an achila if it's b'chtei achilas pras. And then there's a separate inyan of v'savata. So therefore, if you only ate v'savata ma'at, there's no achila b'chtei achilas pras, then according to the Magen Avraham, there's no chiyuv to bench. However, as we said, the Pri Megadim argues. The Pri Megadim says no. Even if you ate ma'at, as long as you became satisfied, you have a chiyuv in Birkas Hamazon min haTorah. So it would seem to be that the Pri Megadim doesn't agree with this yesod of the Minchas Chinuch that you have a din achila. There's no din of v'achalta. V'achalta is just a sipur dvarim. The pasuk is saying v'achalta v'savata beirachta. The v'achalta is a sipur dvarim. The v'achalta is not a halacha. There's no halacha of v'achalta. There doesn't have to be an achila al pi halacha in order to be chayiv in Birkas Hamazon. You just need a v'savata. As long as you have a v'savata, you're mechuyev in Birkas Hamazon. That seems to be the svara of the Pri Megadim. However, the Chemda wants to say, the Chemda in our Parsha wants to say that actually no, the Pri Megadim agrees in principle to the Magen Avraham that v'achalta is a din. There has to be a din achila. To be chayiv in benching, there has to be a v'achalta, there has to be a din achila, and there has to be a v'savata, a din sviyah, and you need both. He agrees in principle to that. Where is he arguing? So he says a beautiful word. They're arguing on what's the nature of this halacha that an achila has to be a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. This halacha of eating a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, that's considered an achila, what does that mean? So the Chemda wants to say that according to the Pri Megadim, that is not a metzias. That's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Meaning, really al pi Torah, what's considered an achila? A ma'isa achila is even a kol shehu. Even a kol shehu al pi halacha, al pi Torah, is considered an achila. You have an achila. Narva then, there's a halacha l'Moshe misinai that when it comes to a mitzvah like matzah, whatever it is, there's a halacha l'Moshe misinai that there's a shiur. You have to eat a shiur b'chtei achilas pras, or by a loisase to be over on eating dam or eating chaylev, or to be over on a loisase. There's a halacha l'Moshe misinai that you have to eat a shiur. What's the shiur? Kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. But that shiur of kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, that's not the definition of achila. That doesn't make it into a ma'isa achila. It's a halacha in din. It's a din in shiurim. To be mekayim the mitzvah, to be over the lois, I said there's a din of a shiur. What's the shiur? The shiur is kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. But even without the shiur, it's still a ma'isa achila. Even the Torah recognizes that as a ma'isa achila. As long as you ate a kol shehu, it's a ma'isa achila. So B'meila says the Kli Chemda, that's the svara of the Pri Megadim. The Pri Megadim will say, when do we require the shiur of kezayis b'chtei achilas pras or the shiur of kedei achilas pras? That's only by a mitzvah or by a loisase, when there's a chiyuv to eat matzah. So you have a din of a shiur. The shiur is a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. You have a loisase, so halacha l'Moshe misinai, you have a shiur. But by achilas reshus, if the achila is just a reshus, there's no reason to require a shiur. Even if a person ate a kol shehu, al pi Torah, that's an achila. So b'meila over here, v'achalta v'savata, says the Pri Megadim, v'achalta isn't a mitzvah. We're not talking about a chiyuv of achalta. It's an achilas reshus. If you ate, v'achalta v'savata beirachta, if you ate and you were satisfied, you have a chiyuv to bench. So since we're dealing with an achilas reshus, there's no halacha l'Moshe misinai here to say that the achila has to be kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. And therefore, what remains is that al pi Torah, even achila kol shehu is an achila. So if a person ate ma'at, says the Pri Megadim, if you ate ma'at and you did not eat the kezayis or the whole thing b'chtei achilas pras, it doesn't matter. You still have the v'achalta, because achila kol shehu is an achila. You have a savata, so now beirachta. You didn't eat it b'chtei achilas pras, but there's no din shiur here. The din of shiurim is only by an asay or a lois asay. You have a shiur. Here there's no din of shiurim in this v'achalta, because this v'achalta isn't a v'achalta of a mitzvah, it's a v'achalta of reshus. That's the reasoning of the Pri Megadim. What does the Magen Avraham say? Light this mahalach, the Magen Avraham would say no. When we say that an achila has to be kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, that's not just the zaytike halacha l'Moshe misinai al shiurim that you have to have a shiur. That is the taich of achila. It's not going to be a ma'isa achila if you don't eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. Less than the shiur, sefeld in the ma'isa achila. So b'meila, says the Magen Avraham, since the pasuk says v'achalta, you have to have an achila. To have an achila, you have to eat b'chtei achilas pras. If you ate ma'at, so heistish ken achila. You don't have an achila. So it comes out, this is the machlokes between the Pri Megadim and the Magen Avraham. How do we understand bichlal the inyan of shiurim? When the Torah gave a shiur that achila has to be kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, the Magen Avraham will say that shiur makes it into an achila. Pachis mikashir, less than a shiur, it's bichlal not a ma'isa achila. It's not an achila. And the Pri Megadim will say no. A ma'isa achila you have even with achila kol shehu. The Torah said it has to be kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. That's halacha l'Moshe misinai. It's a zaytik din, a din of shiurim. When a shiur is required, okay, so you have to eat the shiur. But in our case, there's no inyan to have a shiur because v'achalta is achilas reshus. So b'meila even achila kol shehu is an achila v'savato beirachta. So it comes out that the Pri Megadim and the Magen Avraham both agree that v'achalta v'savata are both criteria which are necessary to have the chiv of benching. Both agree you have to have a chalta, you have to eat. And both agree you have to be savata. And if you're missing one condition, there's no inyan, there's no chiv to bench. They're only arguing what's considered an achila. Is achila kol shehu bichlal considered a ma'isa achila? Or it's nothing until I have the shiur of b'chtei achilas pras, and only b'chtei achilas pras is the ma'isa achila bichlal considered even a ma'isa achila. It's the machlokes. Okay, so moving on in the Parsha, towards the end, Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Yud Gimel, the Parsha V'hoyim Shemaya. And there we have, the Pasuk says, U'la'avdei b'chol levavchem. And Rashi says on this Pasuk, U'la'avdei b'chol levavchem, avodah shehi belev, v'zu hi tefillah. That U'la'avdei b'chol levavchem is the mitzvah of davening, of tefillah. And the Ramam brings it lahalacha hilchas tefillah perek aleph, halacha aleph, mitzvahs aseh l'spalel b'chol yoyim. It's a mitzvah to daven every day. Shenemar v'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. V'piashmua amru sha'avodah zu hi tefillah. V'nemar u'la'avdei b'chol levavchem, our pasuk. Amru chachamim eize hi avodah shebelev zu tefillah. So we have here from our pasuk u'la'avdei b'chol levavchem the mitzvah of davening. So we're going to have a little discussion now about the idea of Kavana B'Tefilah. This is from חידושי רבינו חיים, הלוי on the Rambam, Rabbi Chaim Brisker. It's a beautiful, beautiful word. And basically, Rabbi Chaim is bothered by what seems to be an inconsistency in the Rambam when it comes to Kavana. Because in Perek Dalid of Hilchas Tefillah, the Rambam says, there are 5 things that are absolutely required for davening, and one of them is the Kavana Salev. That Kavana Salev is ma'akiv davening. That's a requirement in davening. That's in the beginning of Perek Dalid, and later in that Perek, in Halacha Tesvav, the Rambam explains Kavana Salev Ketzad. When we say that Kavana Salev is ma'akiv, what does this mean? Called tefillah she'eina bekavana, eina tefillah. Any tefillah without kavana, eina tefillah. V'mispalel b'loi kavana, chayzer u'mispalel bekavana. If you daven without kavana, you have to go back and daven with kavana. Motza daitay mishubeshes v'libay tarud. If a person finds himself in a condition where he's not able to have kavana, asur loy lehispalel ad shetis yashiv daitay. The Rambam says it's also for that person to even attempt to daven until their mind is focused. So that's what the Rambam says. Kavana Salev is so important that tefillah she'eina bekavana eina tefillah, and you have to be chayzer u'mispalel bekavana, and even more so, if you don't think you'll be able to even have kavana, you shouldn't even attempt to daven ad shetis yashav daitem. That's the Rambam in Perek Daled. However, later in Perek Yud, the Rambam again turns his attention to Kavana, and he says, Misha yispalel v'loi kivenes liboy, yachzer v'yispalel b'kavana. The person daven without Kavana, he should daven again. However, now he says, V'im kiven liboy b'bracha rishayna, shuv einoi tzarich. But now the Rambam says, oh, no, it's only by the first bracha. Only by the first bracha, there it's ma'akiv. As long as you had kavana in the first bracha, you're okay. Even if you did not have kavana the rest of davening, it's okay. So says Reb Chaim, the Rambam here is being inconsistent. Because in Perek Dalid, the Rambam stated simply and plainly, Kol tefillah she'eina bekavana eina tefillah. And mistimas lashon harambam, from the language of the Rambam there, it's mashma that this applies to the entire davening. Tefillah she'eina bekavana eina tefillah. It's not a tefillah. So the whole davening requires kavana. Doesn't say over there only the first bracha, but later you don't need. No, it's a simple statement. Kol tefillah she'eina bekavana eina tefillah. Mispalel b'loi kavana chayzer mispalel bekavana. Without differentiating between the first bracha and the rest. But in Perek Yud, all of a sudden the Rambam says about kavana, it's really only ma'akiv in the first bracha, but after the first bracha, even without kavana, you're okay. So how do we understand this? So Reb Chaim basically is machadish that in Perek Daled and in Perek Yud, the Rambam is talking about 2 different types of kavanas. There are 2 different types of kavanas, and we cannot confuse them. There is, we can call it the kavana klolis, a general kavana, and then there is the kavana pratis of pirush hamilos. When a person is davening, they have to have a general kavana as to what they're doing. What are we doing? What is tefillah? Tefillah is you're standing before the Eibishter, you're omed lifnei Hashem umispalel. So that awareness that I'm standing before Hashem and I'm davening, I'm talking to Him, That is a Kavana Klolis. And that is what the Rambam is talking about in Perek Daled. And then there is another Kavana, the Kavana Pratis of what exactly are you saying. As you say the words, what is the meaning of the words that you're saying? Pirush Amilos. That's a Kavana Pratis. And that's what the Rambam is talking about in Perek Yud. So b'meila it's not a stira. When it comes to the Kavana Klolis, the general Kavana that you're oimed lifnei Hashem, so that the Rambam says simply in Perek Daled, Kol tefillah she'eina b'kavana eina tefillah. If you lack that kavana, it's bichlal not a ma'aseh tefillah. What you're doing is not a ma'aseh tefillah. If you don't even have the awareness that you're oimed lifnei Hashem or mispalel, then what you're doing is not a ma'aseh tefillah. And b'meila, it's nothing. And that applies to the whole davening. At any part of davening, if you didn't have the awareness that you're standing before Hashem davening, then those words that you said, says Reb Chaim, it's as if you didn't say them. So this Kavana Klolis is ma'akev b'chol hatfilo kula. And that's the Rambam in Perek Daled. In Perek Yud, the Rambam is talking about a different Kavana. It's talking about the Kavana Pirush Amilos. As you say the words, you have to know what the words mean. So there the Rambam says that really, ideally, you have to have the Kavana Pratis, the Kavana Pirush Amilos, you have to have the whole davening. But if you didn't, as long as you had it in the first bracha, you're okay. So in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, even the Kavana Pratis of Pirush Amilos is also ma'akev. And you have to have in mind the Pirush Amilos, and if you don't, you have to daven again. But after the first bracha, the Kavana Pratis of Pirush Amilos is no longer ma'akev. Even if you didn't have in mind Pirush Amilos, you're still yaitze. But the Kavana Klolis, the general Kavana of what davening is, that you're standing before Hashem, that the Rambam addressed in Perek Daled, that's ma'akev throughout the entire davening, because without it, as we said, it's not a ma'aseh tefillah. The way Reb Chaim explains the difference, he says, the din of the Kavana of Pirush Amilos is a din mesuyam. It's a din of Kavana. There's a requirement to have Kavana. That's not necessary to create the chefza of a ma'aseh tefillah. A chefza of a ma'aseh tefillah you have even without the Kavana Pratis. The Kavana Pratis is a separate din. There's a halacha, you have to have Kavana. It's a din mesuyam. You have to have Kavana, so you have to have Kavana. That's ma'akev in the first bracha. It's not ma'akev after the first bracha, because it's only a din Kavana mesuyamas. However, the Kavana Klolis, that's not a din Kavana. That's a din to create the chefz of a ma'aseh tefillah. Without the Kavana Klolis, it's bichlal not a ma'aseh tefillah. What you're doing is not a ma'aseh tefillah. So since the Kavana Klolis is necessary to bichlal create the ma'aseh tefillah, so that's ma'akev throughout the entire davening. Then he goes on to say a chidush on top of this. It's very interesting. He says there's another difference between the Rambam in Perek Daled and Perek Yud. And that is when a person predicts that they won't be able to have Kavana, should they even attempt to daven? So in Perek Daled, the Rambam said clearly, Matzah daite mishubeshes, v'libay torud, osir loy lehispalel, ad shetis daite. That if you know you won't be able to have Kavana, you shouldn't even try daven. It's osir to daven until you're ready to have Kavana. But in Perek Yud, the Rambam didn't say that. The Rambam just said that you have to have Kavana by davening. And if you didn't have Kavana, yachzer v'yispalel, v'im kiben liba b'bracha rishayna, but if you had Kavana by the first bracha, shub ein tzarech. The Rambam doesn't say there that if a person knows they won't be able to have Kavana in the first bracha, they shouldn't even try daven. Mashma, that if you are in a situation where you know you won't be able to have Kavana in the first bracha, you should still go ahead and daven. So Reb Chaim explains it based on this difference. Again, because we're dealing with two different kavanas. In Perek Daled, we were dealing with a Kavana Klolis, that you're oimed lifnei Hashem, which that's necessary to bichlal create the ma'aseh tefillah. So of course, if you know that you won't be able to have that Kavana, because matzah daite mishubeshes v'libay torud, so if you won't be able to have the Kavana Klolis, that you're oimed lifnei Hashem, so there's no reason to proceed with davening. Because whatever you're going to do is not even going to be a ma'aseh tefillah. So it's also like the hispalel. You have to wait. Don't even attempt to daven. That's because without this Kavana, it's not a Ma'aseh Tefillah. However, in Perek Yud, we're not dealing with the Kavana Klolis, we have a Ma'aseh Tefillah. We're dealing with another halacha, the Kavana of Pirush HaMilos, which is a din of Kavana. It's a protestic din, you have to have Kavana. So here, we don't say that if you know you won't have Kavana, you shouldn't daven. Why? Because since the davening that you will do is still a chefetz of a Ma'aseh Tefillah, so you'll have that. You'll be missing the Kavana. That's a separate thing. So you won't have the extra, the added dimension, the added halacha that you need to have Kavana, Pirush HaMilos, that you won't have. I mean, even though it's ma'akiv in the first bracha. And if you didn't have Kavana, you need to daven again. But if a person is in a situation where he knows he won't be able to have that Kavana at all, says Reb Chaim, you should still go ahead and daven. Because since the davening that you will do will still be considered a cheftze of a Ma'aseh Tefillah, because you have the Kavana Klolis, you're only going to be missing the Kavana Protis of Pirush HaMilos, which that is a din sefes, a din musuyemes of Kavana. So even though you'll be missing that, but there's still an inyan to go ahead and daven. And then he's Meisif Bir on this word by saying we could explain it even better. And that is because according to the Rambam, the chiyuv of davening is midayraisa. It's a mitzvah aseh lehispal. So therefore, Reb Chaim, but the din of kavanas pirush hamilos, the din of kavana that you have to have pirush hamilos, at least b'di'evet in the first bracha, that din is the rabbanon. So therefore, says Reb Chaim, it all makes sense. The kavana klolis, which is necessary to make it a ma'aseh tefillah, without that, you don't even have a kiyum of the mitzvah of tefillah midaraisa. Without the kavana klolis, you didn't do anything. So that's ma'akiv b'chol tefillah. And if you cannot have that kavana, don't daven. But the kavana kloli, the kavana protis of pirush hamilos, since that's only a din derabanan, so if a person is in a situation where he knows he won't be able to have that kavana of pirush hamilos even in the first bracha, says Reb Chaim, you have to daven because you still have a chiv midayraisa. The chiv dayraisa is chal on you to daven, because since you're at least going to have the kavana klolis, you're going to have the ma'aseh tefillah. So midayraisa, what you're doing is going to be recognized as a tefillah. So the chiyuv dayraisa is chal on you. The fact that you won't have kavanas pirush hamilos means that midarabanan you're going to be lacking that extra thing. True, it's ma'akiv, but it's only ma'akiv midarabanan. So even though you know you won't be able to have that kavana, you should still proceed to daven without the kavanas pirush hamilos, because midayraisa you have the chiyuv is chal on you, because your tefillah will still be a ma'aseh tefillah. But if a person won't be able to have the kavana klolis in Perek Daled, since midayraisa won't even be a ma'aseh tefillah, so it's nothing. So there's no reason to go ahead and daven. So that's what Reb Chaim wants to explain, the difference between the Rambam in Perek Daled and the Rambam in Perek Yud. It's interesting to note that there's a sicha of the Rebbe in Chelek Chaf Beis on Parshas Emor, the first sicha. In Orah 36, the Rebbe brings this Reb Chaim. And based on the Sikha there, the Rebbe wants to add another criteria into the Kavana, which makes it a Ma'aseh Tefillah. Even in the first Kavana, the Kavana Klolis, which the Rambam is addressing in Perek Daled, which without that Kavana, it's Bechlal not a Ma'aseh Tefillah. So what is that Kavana? So based on the Rambam and the way Reb Chaim understood, that's the Kavana that you're Oimed Lifnei Hashem. But there, based on that sikha, the Rebbe wants to say there's something else which is required, and that is tzarich liyos hergish d'mischanein b'shas tefillah. Part of the gather of tefillah is ezi avodah shebeleiv, as the pasuk says, "Ulavdi b'chol avavchem ezi avodah shebeleiv zu tefillah." That part of the criteria of davening is that you are going to be mischanen. Mischanen is a regesh shebeleiv. You're mischanen lifnei Hashem. So B'meila says the Rebbe there, we have to insert that into the Kavana Klolis, which Reb Chaim is understanding is Pashut Negeya to making a Ma'aseh Tefillah. So not only do you need the Kavana that you're Oimed Lifnei Hashem to make it a Ma'aseh Tefillah, but according to the Rebbe, you have to also have the Kavana Klolis that you're Mischanen B'shas Tefillah. And if you're lacking the Hergesh of Mischanen, if you're lacking this feeling and this kavan of mischanein, it's inyan klali. Doesn't mean pirush hamilos, but the general attitude, the general feeling of that I'm being mischanen, lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's avodah shebelev, it's a rega shebelev, if I'm missing that inyan of tachnunim, then, like Reb Chaim said, it's bichlal not a ma'aseh tefillah, it's ki'ilu lo yispalel, ein kan tefillah, and the whole thing is nothing. So the Rebbe is agreeing with the Mahalach of Reb Chaim that there is a kavana klolis which is required to bichlal make it a ma'aseh tefillah, to make a chefta shel tefillah, but he's inserting an additional point that not only do we need the kavana of omer lifnei Hashem, we also need the kavana and the hergish of shemischanein b'shas tefillah of tachnunim, because this is negeya to the etzem gather of tefillah, since it's learned from the pasuk ula avdei b'chol levavchem.